Good afternoon, good morning for some of you. Welcome again. For Setla, it's a pleasure to host this morning the webinar Changes in the Audiovisual Market and Implications for Public Policy.
Oh, yeah.
Thank all of you for having accepted our invitation and thank you in advance for your active participation. As a reminder, please mute your microphones to avoid noise in the line. After the presentations, there will be time for the audience to ask questions or share impressions using the chat available. Let me introduce our three top speakers. Mr. Facundo Recondo, Vice President, International Relations and Public Policy, Warner Media Latin America. Welcome, Facundo. Thank you for being here. Roger Edner, founder, Recon Analytics. Thank you, Roger, for being with us. And the keynote speaker, Dr. Raúl Katz, president of Telecom Advisory Services and economy professor at Columbia University, who conducted the base study for this webinar. A pleasure to have you here, Dr. Katz. After as I mentioned, after the presentations, there will be a time for the audience to ask questions or share impressions. Without more preamble, please, Facundo, the audience is yours.
Thank you, Mariliana, and hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for joining this webinar. I would like to briefly discuss the evolution of the content marketplace and how the media ecosystem is transforming. And as you know, traditional content companies now do not just compete with one another, but with OTT providers. You know that the environment has changed a lot, and you know that digitalization is the reason of this. But before start talking about digitalization, I would like to share with you 3 or 4 concepts that I think are relevant and will allow us to understand why this is happening. We are all aware of the OTT streaming services that are being launched. We are all aware that the pay TV industry has completely changed. If you ask me some years ago from a pay TV company, which were the competition, I would talk about other pay TV companies. And now competitors include Google, Facebook, Amazon, and many other companies that were not even in the radar a few years ago. So if I would like to start this concept, the first thing I want to say and the first word I would like you to have in mind is mobility. What has changed is mobility. We are in an era of mobility where the thousands of mobile phones are allowing consumers to consume much more from different places on different devices. So mobility is one of the words you need to have in mind. Okay.
Próxima estación, Palermo.
Yeah,
Cercanía con...
sorry. The second word I would like for you to have in mind is data. The growth of mobility and the growth of data has changed the industry a lot. These are concepts that now looks very familiar and that we talk about every day, but these concepts a few years ago were not part of the industry, were not being analyzed or considered. The mobility, the growth of mobility and the growth of data that we have now, these are things that are completely new for the industry. The traditional pay TV industry or the traditional content industry that we have years ago was not used to consider mobility and was not used to consider data. The TV films, theatrical films were produced without using data, without considering what consumers want. So now we have much more information about consumers. We know what consumers are looking for, and with the amount of devices. Remember that a few years ago, and this is obvious, but it's important to have it in mind, we have only one screen per house, one screen per family. Now we have multiple screens in each house, in each family. So the mobility has allowed us to increase the number of screens by X number, and with the data that we have, we also have the information of what all these devices are consuming. The other word I want you to have in mind is the insights that this mobility revolution plus the data gave us. We have the insights of what consumers want, and that requires us to innovate. So the other word in this line would be innovation. With the amount of devices that we have now, with the amount of data that we have now, with the insights that we have now, we are obliged to innovate. So innovation is another concept that now is a key for any media company. AT&T or Warner Media, they have evolved from telecommunication company to a modern media company that has to innovate and change the business model very often, very frequently, because of the data and the insights we get from consumers. So I'm going to repeat these words again: the mobility, the data, the insights, the innovation, and all these require investments. So all these require the companies to invest for new content, invest for new platforms, invest to give consumers what they want, where they want, and when they want. So it's really, really, really important to understand the direct relation now consumers have with the media companies and with content. There is a really, really close relationship between consumers, content, and the media companies. And that's why the environment is changing so quickly, because the companies have the information from consumers, the data from consumers, and are allowed to adapt and innovate their business models according to this information. And the other thing I also want to mention is that all this innovation requires investment. And now the investments in this model are mainly on content production. The content production now, I think it's the key word. You're going to see all the different platforms fighting and producing more and more every day. I mean fighting when I say competing, sorry for that word, but competing between each other and trying to create high quality content, more content. I think it's the moment in the evolution of the digital content place where more content is being produced. There are more screens, more players, bigger players that need to play on a scale. So they are looking to get local content in each country. So I think it's a really good moment for the content industry that is growing and growing internationally in each country with more local content production. And one of the things that Roger and Raúl are going to talk more after me is that all of these investments, all this innovation, all this giving to consumers what they want is only going to be possible if we are able to minimize regulatory barriers. We see all the big players, international companies trying to invest in different markets to obtain to produce local content, to be able to launch new platforms, to be able to launch new business models. We see the companies looking to invest more and more, and these investments creates more work, are going to be paying more taxes, are going to be benefiting the industries and the economies of many countries. However, they need to have or to minimize the regulatory barriers for these companies to enter into the different markets. Remember that now we are not only talking about the traditional pay TV companies. We're talking about Facebook, Amazon, Google, Netflix, and the competitors, Disney Plus, Apple TV, HBO Max, of course, that we will be launching soon next year in the US and hopefully the following year internationally. So I think it's important for you to understand that the current environment that we have now, it's a consequence of the growth of mobility, of the use of data, of the insight we obtained, of the innovation, of knowing what consumer wants and investing in consequence to give consumers what they need, and trying to minimize regulatory barriers. I think that would be my introduction, and I give the mic to Roger.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Facundo. Thank you very
just
much.
sorry, Roger. Just a second. Just to give a summary of the presentation of Facundo. Basically, we can say there are strong changes in technology mobility and data growth, players, consumer behavior, and audiovisual content consumption. Besides the clear transformation from a single screen to multiple screens, the user is empowered and have the possibility to choose its own preferences. These changes are related with the market innovation, and therefore the industry players have to adapt themselves, invest in content production, and get on the wave of change. Thank you very much, Facundo, for your words. And now, please, Roger, the audience is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to speak to you and give you a brief summary of a presentation I will give later on today here in Los Angeles. Just to mirror the comments of Facundo, the video market is being disrupted and fundamentally changed, and three factors are changing that. Consumers want to watch content when they want and where they want it and how they want it. There's widespread internet connectivity, both fixed and mobile, that enables consumers to access content where and when they want. And content aggregators and content owners can offer that content directly to consumers, bypassing terrestrial television, cable TV, and satellite providers. So when we briefly look at how the behavior pattern has changed, it's the young generation that's always leading the way. So for example, over the last 4 years, from 2014 to 2018, media consumption stayed roughly the same, about 8 hours a day. But smartphone media consumption increased from about 1.5 hours a day to over 3 hours a day, whereas live television and time-shifted television from about 3.5 hours a day to 2 hours a day. And that behavior pattern is not going to change. People watch content on their smartphones, on their computers, and direct. And the segments that are watching television are getting older and older. The median age in the United States of the 10 biggest broadcast TV shows ranges from 47 to 59 years old. That means half of the viewers are older and the other half of the viewers are younger than that age group. When we look at news, the median age of a CNN viewer, for example, is 60. That of Fox News and CNBC is 65. So the young segment is clearly moving away from live television and time-shifted television. But on-demand video is really hitting a stride. You know, we have Netflix with more than 150 million customers globally and about 60 million here in the US. We have Disney just launching Disney Plus and having, within a day of its launch, 10 million customers. We have the non-traditional entrants like Amazon Prime and Apple TV. They're not in the business of selling you video programming, but they give it to you as part of buying an iPhone or having a Amazon Prime membership, so that you can get your packages within a day or two. And so this really makes life very difficult for more traditional players, because the marketplace is changing so dramatically. But this change has also changed, is not at the expense of quality. Because when we look at the Emmy Awards for 2019, 101 Emmy Awards were awarded. HBO 134, Netflix 127, Amazon 15, National Geographic 8, NBC 7, CNN 5, and FX Network 15. If you had only traditional over-the-air television, you could only see 5% of the awarded programs. If you had cable and satellite TV, it was 59%. But if you cut the wires and cut the satellite content, you could have watched 76% of the programs that got an Emmy Award. So there's not only a shift in consumption, but also in quality. The quantity of shows has increased dramatically. When we look at TV shows in the season of 2010-2011, we had 198 TV shows in production in the United States. In the season for 2018-2019, it was 465. This has been both in digital, in broadcast, and in cable. But what's even more amazing is where all the content has been produced. California remains the #1 place where shows are being produced, but it's only now representing half of the production. And many more places have grown substantially, ranging from Georgia in the United States, Louisiana, British Columbia in Canada, Ontario. And that has really broadened the base where TV shows are being produced, which is an opportunity for TV production in other countries also to spread out and be in more places. Now, the companies that are being disrupted, are most vulnerable, are both the cable industry and satellite industry. Cable TV providers in the United States have basically become independent from their television subscriptions and are indifferent to it because they have morphed into broadband providers. The satellite providers don't have that opportunity and have lost millions of customers basically every year. And that is putting a lot of strain on companies. We have here in the United States 2 providers, Dish Networks, which is planning to become a mobile phone company and provides mobile 5G connectivity. And in the case of DirecTV, they have been acquired by AT&T to marry more content to that. So in summary, behavior patterns are changing. How it's being consumed is changing. Where it's being produced is changing. And how they're accessing it is changing. And as a result, we have a lot more content for consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. As an additional summary of your presentation on this audiovisual market configuration, it's key the ubiquity of the content, powered by the widespread broadband connectivity and the possibility for the content aggregators and content owners to offer directly to the consumer. The preferred device to consume content is the mobile, and definitely the linear TV is being displaced. Especially younger generations are moving away from live and time shift television. Non-traditional players have the content as an additional service to their main products. And the on-demand providers are winning most awards for original content as a demonstration of the quality shift. The production is not longer concentrated in few places. Um, Thank you again, Roger. And now we have the keynote speaker, our friend, Dr. Raúl Katz. Please, Dr. Katz, the audience is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Mariliana. Can you guys hear me? Can you guys see the presentation on your screens? Can you see it?
Not yet, not yet.
Give me a second until I see whether share screen. I'm just trying to get my, you got it?
Yes.
Okay, very
Yes,
good.
sir.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of somewhat tag along some of the concepts that were presented by the prior speaker in terms of trying to insert my presentation within some of the trends that were presented before. In particular, zeroing in on the changes that are occurring in the Brazilian market, and in that context, try to bring some sort of theoretical frameworks in order to understand some of these trends. And the basic element or the thread of my presentation is that these disruptions that both Facundo and Roger were talking about are not just a matter of the present. Disruption, integration, vertical integration, disintegration, the emergence of specialists are a feature of the development of the audiovisual industry for many years, and in particular, not only at a global level or let's say in the centers of production, but also in cases like Brazil. So let's start by looking at something that many of the speakers are probably very familiar with, which is basically what is the value chain of the audiovisual market, and how can we conceptualize it? Basically, you have moving from left to right, content production, the packaging in terms of programming, distribution, and devices. Devices being, you know, the sort of the technology that enables us to access content, distribution, satellite, cable, and the like, broadcasting. Packaging is how do we create content that is actually attracted or targeted to certain audiences by virtue of their needs, and finally production. Now, if you look at these value chain, originally, the industry was relatively stable. You had broadcasters, Globo in Brazil, ABC, NBC, and CBS in the United States, TF1 in France, that they were somewhat vertically integrated, going from production to distribution. Obviously, they could access content produced by studios independently, and finally, the electronics manufacturers. These value chain structure was prevalent, stable. Profit pools were very stabilized all the way through roughly the 60s. And starting at that time, and when I'm talking 60s, I'm talking 1960. Starting at that point, a number of disruptions occur. The first one is the emergence of cable TV and satellite distribution that suddenly produced or presented another way of reaching consumers independently from broadcasters. The second stage was the emergence of the VHS cassettes that provided consumers with the ability to consume content whenever they wanted to by accessing video stores. Obviously, that was superseded by Blockbuster as a way of leveraging technology on the managing of the long tail that enabled Blockbuster to eliminate the independent video stores as a distribution platform. Netflix obviously overrode Blockbuster on the basis of the DVD production. But essentially, before even the emergence of video streaming, what we see the industry is moving from progressive waves of disruption from the 60s onwards, and that was somewhat propelled by new technologies, whether it's cable TV, DTH for satellites, the VHS cassette, or DVDs. And in that context, then, the first conclusion that I wanted to emphasize is that disruption, disintermediation, vertical integration are not just things of current trends, but it has existed within the industry ever since the industry gained access to new technologies. But enter the video streaming, and what video streaming and OTTs enabled is progressive moves along the value chain, either from Netflix or Amazon or Google TV, or even the manufacturers of devices that suddenly realize that the centers of gravity of value chain control, strategic control of customers, relate in the middle of the value chain within packaging and on in distribution of content. So that's where we are in right now. And the interesting thing is that, as was actually anticipated a little bit by Facundo and Roger, content is becoming a critical element in garnering solid positions within the value chain. Just as a matter of evidence, Netflix and Amazon today are investing in the order of $22 billion on content development, either through acquisition or original programming. And that is actually exactly the amount that the three top broadcasters in the United States are investing. So just to give you a sense of how content is becoming a critical element of the business model of these OTT platforms. Obviously, this integration is, we've seen recently with the launch of Disney Plus, another element of both vertical integration within content production and also horizontal integration in terms of production and across the value chain. So models are of different types. And this is something that many of you are familiar with. You can have either transaction-based video on demand or advertisement-based video on demand, hybrids and the like. So there's no such a thing as a single model. Innovation is a pervasive element that enables people to test new business models and try to capture significant strategic positions within that value chain. Within that context, and as I was anticipating before, content becomes critical, and local content becomes critical. My hypothesis is now, independently of whether governments are trying to stimulate the development of local content, the development of local content is a critical strategic direction of all players in the industry. Partly because consumers want that, and partly because of what position these OTT platforms need to achieve. Today, you cannot just capture strategic positions in that value chain by providing content that is centrally produced, which is partly the reason why 50% of the content worldwide is produced in California, and the rest is being developed beyond the California borders. As an example of the things that are occurring, look at the India percent of content production being produced within the Indian borders, obviously stimulated by Bollywood, but also by the fact that the Indian audiences are keen in accessing that particular content. Same thing we see it in Europe, albeit at a lower level, and we're going to be seeing as well in Brazil. Now, consumers are benefiting from this. They're benefiting, one, because obviously they get the content they want, but also because these platforms of content distribution are, by virtue of serving these two-sided markets, are adding value that didn't exist before. First, on the right-hand side of the chart, what you see is basically a reduction in search costs. And this, in internet lingo, what it means is that we can access the content we want in a much easier fashion than in the original way by which we were looking at the TV grid. Second, we have recommendations that allows us to actually navigate in the universality of content, information on the content that we are consuming, and more importantly, the ability to tailor and personalize our content consumption. So beyond local content, what consumers are benefiting from is this ability to tailor the consumption experience to our particular needs. Let's turn gears to the Brazilian market. And Brazil one of the reasons why we focused on Brazil was because in this particular study is because, as many of you are familiar with, and that's somewhat presented in the study, Brazil is in the midst of defining critical elements on the regulation of the audiovisual market. And interestingly enough, in terms of having access to conceptual frameworks that would provide some understanding of these trends were very obsolete. In fact, one of the key studies that served as a basis to determine future moves in the regulatory side was a study that was developed by Ancine and Anatel published in 2015 with 2014 data. And as I mentioned before, disruption in this market is proceeding so fast that trying to define a regulatory framework on the basis of the trends that were quantified or formalized in 2014 is somewhat of a problem. We're basically defining regulatory frameworks on the basis of a rear view mirror, and that could entail some significant risks to the development of the industry in Brazil. So with that in mind, let's look at Brazil. And what you see here in this chart is the way audiences are changing in terms of access to content, the decline on pay TV platforms, and the explosive development of the OTT platforms. And basically what you have is a process of substitution. People are not, this is the same phenomenon that occurred in music. People are not consuming less content, they're consuming more, except that the substitution is how is it that they are accessing that particular content. So OTT is becoming a more important platform in that context. The features of vertical integration that were defined or were sort of anticipated on a global scale also exist in Brazil in terms of content players moving into distribution, device players moving into content, also transport one, obviously the telecommunications companies. So these sort of convergence and vertical integration across the value chain that is prevalent on a global scale also exists in Brazil. These stages of the value chain are not sort of like stages that are independent in and of themselves. People are moving across them, and there is more of a convergence. Now, in that context, competitive intensity is accelerating. What you have here is two charts that actually quantify the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, and many of you are familiar with this. Is basically an index that enables us to quantify the level of industry concentration in the market and therefore the intensity of competitive dynamics. And it's calculated by square the market shares, adding the squares of the market shares of the players in the market. On the left, you see what's occurring in pay TV. And basically what you see over time that this HHI index is declining. The lower the number, the higher the competitive intensity. And obviously, the more benefits to consumers. On the right-hand side, what you see is it was more difficult to draw a time series just because OTTs are newer in the market. But you see is that if I cut it across Latin American countries in 2018, Brazil is one of the more competitive markets when it comes to OTT. So not only you have a massive substitution in terms of patterns of consumption of content in Brazil or vertical integration, what you have is an acceleration of competitive intensity. And as regulators know, more competition is better for consumers. In the next slide, what you see is that basically the long tail in terms of content acquisition. Yeah, Netflix is a prevalent player in Brazil, but so are a number of players, which is good in the sense that what this means is that consumers can tailor the consumption to their particular needs, and that goes well beyond the consumption of content via Netflix on OTTs. Within this, and anticipating and sort of like giving further support to the notion of local content becoming prevalent, that also occurs in Brazil. On the left-hand side, what you see is that the percentage of locally produced program hours by type in pay TV, in particular seeing how much is Brazilian productions. And this is percentage of hours. And what you see over time, that that's the bottom bar, that is increasing year after year. We still don't have 2018 numbers because Ancine hasn't released the latest study on this. But basically, you see the trend. Local content in pay TV is increasing. In addition to that, on the right-hand side, what you see is that local production of OTT players in Brazil is also increasing. If I take the top 7 OTT platforms, roughly 6% of national movies are 6% of movies are produced nationally, and the same thing for series. So what you see is more local content, partly stimulated by the regulatory framework on content production, but partly because the industry, as I mentioned before, needs to provide local content in order to consolidate competitive positions. Obviously, digital advertising is becoming prevalent. This is sort of a consequence of some of the trends that I was mentioning before. I won't belabor the point on this particular case. But what you see then is an increase in variety. Number of pay TV channels by genre is increasing over time, year after year, and the number of OTT platforms. So as you see, what I'm threading around is the consumer benefits of that competitive intensity. More local content, more variety, and the last dimension is better pricing. In fact, on the left-hand side, I compare the prorated average of the monthly pricing of the most economic pay TV offers by market in Latin America, and as you see, Brazil is the second most economic offers when compared to other Latin American countries. Well, this is good. So the third element of consumer benefit beyond variety and local production is the fact that pricing for access of the content is declining. So another area of consumer benefits. And the same thing occurs when I take only a look at pay TV offers within Brazil. Pricing is declining. So again, we're accessing better content. We're customizing the consumption of that content. We're accessing more variety, and we are paying less for this. So the other side of the coin of this trend is that the industry is developing in Brazil. We just don't depend on production or an industry being developed in international markets or California. The fact is that today the audiovisual market industry in Brazil is becoming very important, partly fostered by the demand for local content. Today, basically, if I look at the pay TV broadcasting and OTT industries, 2017 is 37.9 billion reais, which this is not to sneeze at because that represents 0.58% of the Brazilian GDP, which is close to we spend more time in Brazil thinking about it, whether it's pharmaceuticals or home appliances. And also on a different scale, today the industry represents a large source of content acquisition, of production and therefore job creation, 335,000 direct and indirect jobs. So when it comes to the other side of the coin, we have a critical element of economic contribution of the audiovisual industry in Brazil that is very critical. So considering those trends, the key issue is what to do from a regulatory standpoint. My initial advice, even we touch on this, is watch out for what we do, because the worst thing we could do is develop frameworks that could threaten what is intrinsically a very dynamic industry that is meeting the needs of consumers. The traditional value chain is being disrupted. That occurs not only globally, but within Brazil in terms of different features, whether it's disintermediation, fragmentation, emergence of specialists. Everyone is competing not only on distribution, but also on content, and consumers are benefiting. This, in a way, is what you need to retain out of the whole presentation. But in that context, then, is the implications for the industry, for Brazil. Clearly, we shouldn't look to over-regulate the industry. In fact, to some degree, the invisible hand is developing in such a way that consumers are benefiting. Clearly, I'm not proning the disappearance of regulation, because I believe that regulation has to play a role, either monitoring the rates of concentration in the industry, or even some of the access to content that could be detrimental to consumers as a whole. But in terms of restrictions for vertical integration or the development of content quotas, that's not something that the industry needs today, because the industry is developing in that direction. In fact, restrictions to vertical integration could be detrimental to protecting the local industry and stifle competition. And we don't want to do that. And rather than think about regulating OTT platforms in the same way that pay TV platforms are regulated, which is something that is under consideration by some parties in Brazil, the issue is, how do you define a level playing field where you lower the regulation of pay TV platforms to some sort of a consistent and homogeneous level with OTTs, allowing the rules of the market to play out? That is to say, create a level playing field along those lines. And clearly, the objective here is, how do we benefit consumers in terms of either diversity, pricing, multiplicity of offers. And within that case, what we need to do is, or I consider that we need to do in Brazil, is eliminate restrictions to vertical integration and allow the new entry of new players to operate within these very dynamic rules of market competition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Katz.
Marieliana?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Katz. Some of the power concepts that Dr. Katz gave us, disruption, disintermediation, content as a key asset, local content as critical, multiple business models. The Brazilian market is very competitive in terms of OTTs, and this means benefits for the consumer, as variety of options, lower prices, and for the economy, definitely the job creation. Just to add some words, we think that there are two main topics here. There is a modern regulatory framework, and for sure the fight against piracy. According to the Brazilian Ministry of Justice, there are 20 million households that consume pirate content online. Even though it is important to recognize the effort of the Brazilian government with the 404 operation recently performed, as a vital element in this fight is ending impunity. For sure, it is important as well to raise the awareness on the risks and consequences of the online piracy. Please, to the audience, if you have any questions or comments, we have the chat available. You know, if you want to, could be impressions, comments. Everybody's so quiet. Don't know if okay, seems that there are no additional questions. Okay, thank you very much. We have in the audience our president, the president of ASIET, Mr. Angel Melguizo. Angel, if you want to give us some words.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Marieliana, and of course, thank you, Facundo, Roger, Raúl. It was great, and I just wanted to say I mean, as president of the board of ASIET, the Asociación Interamericana de Empresas de Telecomunicaciones, this is the kind of event that we want to strengthen. It's an event and it's a discussion that has not been shy at all in addressing a key topic, that is how the audiovisual market is progressing. Second, I think it's the kind of event that we want to foster because it's based on very solid research. We need new ideas because as the economy Nobel Prize winner Jan Tirol said the other day, I mean, digital is transforming everything. So we should be humble and innovative also in ways to think, to regulate and to implement policies in this area. And I think the discussion and the ideas that Professor Katz shared today with Facundo and Roger made that clear. And obviously, it's great to have Professor Katz around as a good and great ally and one of the main experts in the world. So, just I wish that these great ideas on Brazil and also great ideas that can be valid elsewhere drive action. We need a smart regulation to benefit consumers, and let's try that these ideas transform the markets for good as we expect. So all yours, Mariliana, and thanks a lot for the panelists, and obviously special thanks to Professor Katz.
Thank you very much, Angel. We have a question for Professor Katz. Is from Beatriz Filippo. It says there's an ongoing discussion about video on demand legislation in Brazil and how it might benefit the small audiovisual producers. Do you believe that's a way of helping these small companies?
Okay. Yeah, let me talk about that. This is interesting. Can you hear me?
Yes,
this
sir.
point of SME companies on the production arena is an interesting point. There are very few studies that actually quantify the how dynamic is the audiovisual market in terms of the emergence of independent SME players. In fact, the one that I'm familiar with is one conducted by Ofcom in the United Kingdom that actually indicates that the barriers to entry for independent producers of content are lowering, and in fact that the participation of independent players is quite dynamic in the UK. The same thing would occur in Brazil in terms of, let's put aside the regulatory framework. I think that in and of itself, the industry is very interested in stimulating the emergence of SME players, particularly in terms of what I call the spillover effects on production and the ability of large producers of content, being OTT platforms or pay TV players, to stimulate the development of local production developed by SME players, just by the mere fact that they are more capable to satisfying some of the needs for localization. So the industry is actually all in support of the development of SME players. Now, in that context, then, what could governments do in order to stimulate that? I mean, clearly, the issue in terms of innovation, there are the classical measures that go for financial support, any sort of stimulations for the acquisition of equipment. But those measures are very much the same as one would see in other areas of the digital ecosystem, where there are different startups. But I wouldn't see anything else than providing the necessary financial stimulations for those SME players to actually play a role in the ecosystem of production. The rest is going to be left to the large players that would definitely are going to be exiting for the emergence of or the development of these SME players. I don't know, it might have not been focused on in my presentation, but if you look at the multiplier of direct to indirect jobs and output in the Brazilian audiovisual market, that's very high. It's 2.64. That's much higher than the multiplier that you might see in other industries, potentially telecommunications. What that says is that, in fact, to the audiovisual industry are for every single player or dollar of output that you see on the direct side, sort of generated by the audiovisual players, 2.64 dollars or jobs are generated downstream. Now that's very good, because what that says is that the spillover effects are very important in audiovisual. So I wouldn't see more than sort of initiatives on the financial stimulation and creating ease of entry for some of these players to be the necessary elements of a new regulatory framework.
Thanks. We have another question from Isabela Gaitan. It says, what about broadcasters and free-to-air TV? What about broadcasters regulation? Do you think they also need a level playing field, especially in terms of content restrictions? This is a question for Dr. Katz.
Yeah, I can see the question from Isabella Gaitan, where it says, what about broadcasters' free-to-air regulation? Do you think they also need a level playing field, especially in terms of content restrictions? I particularly don't like restrictions. I mean, in and of itself, restrictions in a market that is developing so such a dynamic pace, restrictions would be sort of not the word that I would choose for. Clearly, I mean, from that perspective, is the only element that I would see is that broadcasters shouldn't be able to raise any barriers to entry to any players in the field, and allow the other players in other stages of the value chain to operate and provide alternative means of distribution, alternative sources of programming, and the like. And that's where regulation can play a role. If you see that any of the players in the ecosystem, being in this case, Isabella, for broadcasters, are raising anti-competitive moves in terms of preventing some of the players for entering the field, that would be an area where regulators should intervene.
Thank you, Dr. Katz. There's a final question for Facundo. It says, if Warner Media is going to launch the OTT HBO Max in Brazil.
Hello, Marina, this is Facundo. How are you?
Hi, Facundo.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Perfect. Sorry, was on mute.
No problem. Did you hear the question? It's
Can
about
repeat it?
It's about the launch in Brazil of the HBO Max OTT.
Sure. The company has announced the launch of HBO Max for early next year in the US and in 2021 internationally. Unfortunately, there are still no plans regarding the launching in Brazil because of the regulatory uncertainty that we have right now in Brazil.
Thank you, Facundo. I think our time is up, and just to say thank you very much for all the active participation and to all the attendees, and for sure thank you to our speakers. The presentation of Dr. Katz, it's going to be available and will be sent to you a link to access this presentation. Thank you very much for you all, and have a nice day. Thank you.